The first alarms reached Earth as scattered, half-believed reports from deep space listening posts that had watched unfamiliar formations slipping to the outer dark with the quiet confidence of beings who had crossed countless systems without resistance. And when the data reached the offices of fleet intelligence, the conclusion was immediate and chilling, because the ships were not explorers or traders but organized in layered combat groups. Heavy carriers protected by screens of cruisers, and needle-shaped escorts moving with disciplined precision. And within hours their transmissions followed, a calm and perfectly translated declaration sent to every major human network stating that Earth and all human colonies were submit to immediate annexation under the authority of the Carthax Dominion, that resistance would be considered inefficient and therefore corrected, and that humanity would be cataloged, relocated, and utilized according to its biological and industrial value. And in the first moments after the message there was shock, then disbelief, then a rush of angry voices across governments and military commands. Because despite centuries of science fiction and decades of careful space expansion, no one had truly expected the first contact with a major alien power to come as a demand for slavery. And yet the evidence was undeniable as telescopes and long-range sensors showed the alien armada slowing at the edge of the solar system, confident enough to announce itself before even entering effective weapon range. While on Earth, President Daniel Harper convened an emergency council that included fleet commanders, scientists, diplomats, and intelligence analysts, all of them aware that what they were seeing represented a technological and numerical advantage far beyond anything humanity had openly demonstrated. And still the first instinct was not surrender but assessment, because humanity had learned long ago that appearances in war often hit fatal. Assumptions, and as analysts broke down the Carthax fleet composition, they noticed patterns that suggested a doctrine built on overwhelming force and psychological dominance, the kind used by empires that had grown accustomed to enemies who collapsed before a real fight began. And that observation spread quietly through the room as Admiral Karen Holt, a veteran of the Outer Colony Defense Forces, spoke in a calm, steady voice that the Carthax were behaving like conquerors who had never been, forced to adapt, announcing themselves, issuing ultimatums, assuming compliance, and that such habits usually meant they had not yet faced an opponent willing to absorb the first blow in order to study and counter. And while diplomats argue for buying time, for opening channels, for learning more, the first physical proof of Carthax intent arrived when a remote mining station beyond Pluto went silent. Its last transmission a broken image of a massive alien boarding craft attaching to its hull, and cutting through with weapons that burned like blue suns, followed by a single panicked voice saying they were taking people alive. And that was the moment the debate ended, because the realization that humans were being seized, cataloged, and likely prepared for transport as property ignited something older than politics, and orders went out across the solar system for fleets to mobilize, not in parade formation or with broadcast defiance, but quietly with the kind of disciplined urgency that came from knowing the first phase of a war would determine whether there would even be a second. And as task groups began to assemble near Earth, Mars, and the outer defensive rings, scientists from the Strategic Research Directorate brought forward projects that had until then existed only in classified briefings and controlled tests. Technologies developed in response to the possibility that one day humanity would meet a power that saw it not as an equal, but as a resource. And these included experimental drive systems capable of short-range spatial distortion, allowing ships to appear where conventional sensors predicted empty space, as well as weapons platforms designed to operate across multiple engagement layers, from kinetic impacts accelerated to fractions of light speed to directed energy fields that could collapse shield harmonics by forcing them into destructive resonance. And while none of these had yet been used in open battle, their existence meant that humanity's apparent technological level, the one visible to civilian shipping and open scientific exchange, was only part of the truth. And as the Carthax fleet advanced inward with steady confidence, deploying reconnaissance drones and broadcasting repeated surrender demands, their commanders observed what they believed to be a disorganized, inferior species scrambling to respond, not realizing that beneath the surface of human society there existed a long-cultivated culture of preparation for the worst case a belief that survival in a vast and often hostile universe required not just optimism but contingency. And so while public channels carried speeches about unity and resolve, and evacuation plans were quietly activated from major population centers, the real work took place in secure command rooms where officers and analysts constructed layer response scenarios, mapping how to draw the Carthax into engagement zones where their numerical advantage could be blunted, and their assumptions turned against them. And in the Carthax flagship, Supreme Commander Zaurith observed the system through holographic projections and felt only mild curiosity, because the humans, according to every prior assessment, were a young species with fragmented political structures and limited interstellar combat experience, useful as labor and potentially as auxiliary troops once properly conditioned, and he saw no reason to rush, believing that the display of his armada would be enough to compel submission without significant losses. It was his confidence, born of centuries of easy conquests, that would shape every decision he made in the opening days of the campaign, setting in motion a chain of events that would transform humanity from a dismissed minor power into the most feared strategic force the galaxy had ever faced. As the Carthax Armada pushed deeper into the heliosphere, their advanced formations began deploying automated suppression platforms designed to cripple planetary communications and orbital traffic, and from their perspective the lack of immediate large-scale resistance only confirmed their belief that humanity was hesitating, arguing, fracturing under the psychological weight of imminent conquest, while in reality the silence was deliberate, a controlled vacuum created by human command to mask movements and conceal the true disposition of their forces. And in underground command centers and hardened orbital stations, officers like Admiral Holt coordinated a strategy that accepted the temporary loss of outlying installations in exchange for time, because every hour allowed more ships to slip into hidden positions, more experimental systems to be brought online, and more data to be gathered on Carthax sensor ranges, reaction times, and tactical formations. And it was during this phase that analysts noticed a critical weakness in Carthax doctrine, a reliance on centralized command ships that coordinated entire battle groups through continuous high-bandwidth quantum communication links that were assumed to be unbreakable because no known civilization had previously demonstrated the ability to interfere with them. And within the Strategic Research Directorate, a team led by communications physicist Laura Bennett confirmed that while the links could not be jammed in the traditional sense, they could be distorted by flooding local space with precisely tuned gravitic noise, creating micro-fluctuations that introduce latency and desynchronization across the network. And this would not cut the Carthax fleets off completely, but would be enough to disrupt the perfect timing their formations relied upon, turning rigidly coordinated advances into slightly disordered ones. And in war, slight disorder was often the opening through which disaster entered, and so as the alien vanguard crossed the orbit of Saturn and began to fan out, confident in their layered shields and overlapping fire coverage, human stealth platforms already lay in wait, small, unassuming vessels whose hulls absorbed and scattered most known sensor wavelengths, carrying gravitic pulse generators that had never been tested in combat, and when the order was given they activated in sequence, releasing waves of controlled spatial distortion that rippled outward like invisible tides. And in the command decks of Carthax cruisers, operators began to report minor timing errors, weapon systems responding milliseconds late, formation corrections arriving out of phase, nothing severe enough to cause alarm, but enough to force local commanders to rely more heavily on autonomous decision-making, something their doctrine discouraged. And it was at this moment, when the Carthax believed they were simply dealing with the minor friction of operating in a new stellar environment, that the first true human counterstroke was launched, not as a massive fleet engagement, but as a series of precise, brutal ambushes. Because from concealed positions near the asteroid belts and the shadowed regions of gas giant magnetospheres, human strike groups emerged using the experimental distortion drives, appearing inside what the Carthax believed were secure buffer zones. And they did not announce themselves or issue challenges. They simply fired, releasing coordinated volleys of kinetic projectiles, accelerated to such velocities that by the time Carthax sensors registered their approach, impact was already inevitable, and the first cruiser to be hit lost its forward shield array and much of its command section in a single flash of white light, the sudden destruction shocking nearby vessels that had never experienced an attack that ignored the defensive envelope so completely and almost simultaneously directed energy beams tuned to exploit the harmonic weaknesses of Carthax shielding. Lanced out, causing localized shield collapse and opening brief windows through which follow-up strikes poured, and in the span of minutes several forward units were crippled or destroyed, not in a grand, visible battle, but in a series of isolated engagements that sowed confusion and forced the Carthax to slow their advance and re-establish formation integrity. And on Earth, as the first confirmed reports of successful human strikes reached the Emergency Council, there was no celebration, only a quiet, grim acknowledgement that the opening phase had worked as intended, that the Carthax had been forced to react, to question, and to divert attention inward to their own vulnerability. And President Harper addressed the nation in a brief, carefully worded broadcast, stating that humanity had been attacked and that humanity was responding, that the coming days would be difficult, that sacrifices would be required, but that surrender was not an option because the cost of submission would be the end of human freedom itself, and across the planet in its colonies, in shipyards, research facilities, and military bases, men and women listened and returned to their stations with a sense that history had crossed a threshold, that the age of humanity as a peripheral species was ending, and that whatever the outcome, the galaxy would never again be able to ignore the will of Earth. The Carthax command structure reeled as reports of unexpected losses filtered back through the distorted communication net. And while Supreme Commander Zaurath maintained an outward posture of control, ordering reinforcement of forward elements and the acceleration of planetary suppression timetables, the tone within the flagship shifted from casual certainty to irritated focus, because the humans were not behaving as a species awaiting subjugation, but as one executing a layered defense with surprising coordination. And as damaged vessels withdrew for repairs and new formations were assembled, Carthax tactical officers began to map the pattern of attacks, noting precision timing, the exploitation of shield vulnerabilities, and the uncanny way human ships seemed to appear at the edges of sensor resolution, strike, and vanish before effective counterfire could be brought to bear. And in their cultural framework, this suggested either advanced stealth technology or an enemy willing to accept extreme risk to achieve local superiority, both of which challenged a long-held assumption that humanity was technologically and psychologically unprepared for sustained high-intensity warfare. And while the Carthax regrouped, human planners moved into the second phase of their response, shifting from probing strikes to the shaping of a decisive engagement, because the goal was never merely to inflict losses, but to force the Dominion to commit its main strength into a battle on terms it did not fully understand. And to that end, controlled leaks were allowed to pass through diplomatic and commercial channels, hints of panic, of political division, of debates within the United Nations and the colonial assemblies about the possibility of negotiating terms, all designed to reinforce the Carthax belief that psychological pressure was working and that a firm show of force near Earth would break human resolve. And the bait was set when a human task force made it conspicuous, stand near the orbit of Mars, forming up in a defensive posture that, to Carthax analysts, appeared understrength and hastily organized, and the Dominion responded as expected, dispatching a powerful battle group to crush what they believed to be a symbolic last line, a demonstration that would clear the way for orbital dominance over the inner system. And as this Carthax force advanced, its commanders confident in their layered shields and numerical superiority, they did not detect the subtle rearrangement of human assets around the region, stealth platforms seeding space with sensor ghosts, electronic warfare nodes positioning themselves to project false signatures, and heavier units holding just beyond the range where conventional drives will allow timely interception, waiting for the moment when distortion drives could carry them into optimal firing positions. And when the Carthax battle group closed to what they calculated was the edge of effective human engagement range, they opened fire with long-range energy barges meant to overwhelm defenses and shatter morale, and human ships responded, their shields flaring under the impact, some vessels taking damage and falling back in ways that seemed to confirm the Carthax assessment that they were facing a force on the verge of collapse. And it was at this point, when the Dominion commanders ordered their formation to tighten and press forward to deliver the decisive blow, that the human trap closed because the gravitic noise generators were activated at full power, causing a sudden spike in communication latency and sensor distortion across the Carthax network. And in that same instant, multiple human strike groups emerged from distortion jumps inside the flanks and rear of the alien formation, appearing in volumes of space that should have been unreachable without hours of approach. And the effect on the Carthax battle group was immediate and catastrophic, as their defensive coverage, optimized for threats from the front, was suddenly riddled with gaps, and into those gaps poured concentrated fire, kinetic penetrators slamming into hulls before point defense systems could track them, energy beams carving through weakened shield sectors, and precision missiles homing on reactor nodes and command modules, and within minutes several Carthax capital ships were burning wrecks, their crews either dead or struggling to contain cascading system failures, and the rest of the formation, its coordination shattered by communication delays and the loss of key command vessels, attempted to break contact and reestablish order, only to find that human forces were not pursuing in a disorganized rush, but executing pre-planned intercept courses, cutting off retreat vectors and forcing the engagement into a series of brutal close-range fights where the theoretical advantages of Carthax numbers and heavy shielding were neutralized by human maneuverability and fire control, and from the flagship of the Dominion, Zaurath watched the battle unfold with growing unease, realizing that the humans had not only anticipated his response, but had shaped it, drawing his forces into a confrontation that exposed the rigidity of Carthax doctrine and the adaptability of human command. And for the first time since the beginning of the campaign, the possibility that this would not be a simple annexation, but a true war, one whose outcome was no longer certain, began to take root in the minds of the invaders. The destruction of several forward Carthax cruisers near Mars sent ripples of panic to the rest of the Armada as Supreme Commander Zaurath scrambled to regain control, issuing orders that were already compromised by the latency introduced by human gravitic distortion fields, and every adjustment made by one ship propagated inconsistently through the network, creating a cascade of misaligned maneuvers that humans exploited with lethal precision, and as the inner system became a theater of sudden, disjointed skirmishes, Earth's fleet continued to execute pre-planned ambushes, appearing from unexpected vectors, striking critical systems, and vanishing before counterattacks could fully target them, while human engineers on orbital shipyards and remote asteroids push experimental weapon systems into combat-ready status, including adaptive railguns capable of altering projectile mass and velocity mid-flight to penetrate dynamic shields, electromagnetic pulse projectors designed to temporarily collapse Carthax electronics without disabling environmental life support systems, and gravitic tether arrays able to subtly shift the trajectory of enemy vessels, all coordinated through a command network that blended conventional channels with secure quantum links and optical transmission redundancy, ensuring that despite the chaotic appearance of combat, human units move with synchronized understanding that the aliens could not detect or predict. And in the midst of this, human political leadership maintained calm, issuing statements emphasizing defense and survival, while allowing the fleet to operate autonomously, a balance of public morale and operational secrecy. And as battle damage reports accumulated, it became clear that the Carthax had underestimated human ingenuity, that their centuries of conquest over predictable species had blinded them to the adaptability of one that would fight with cunning and coordination rather than raw strength alone, and the psychological impact on Carthax crews was immediate, some showing hesitation, others attempting unauthorized maneuvers, while human signals intelligence intercepted communications, analyzed patterns of uncertainty, and adjusted strike protocols in real time to exploit these weaknesses, turning hesitation into exposure and exposure into destruction. And while Supreme Commander Zaurath attempted to consolidate forces near Jupiter to reassert dominance and protect supply lines, human forces executed feints toward the outer system, drawing detachments into traps where concentrated fire awaited them, and each engagement further eroded the Carthax advantage, not by numbers alone, but by forcing them to fight in ways their rigid doctrine had never trained them to respond to, and simultaneously, civilian and scientific communities across Earth and Mars mobilized auxiliary support, launching automated drones, repair and salvage vessels, and emergency supplies to orbital platforms and hidden stations, ensuring the fleet's operational tempo could be sustained. And as the human strategy unfolded, it became increasingly apparent that this was not simply a defensive campaign, but the deliberate shaping of a conflict designed to reveal and exploit systemic flaws in an opponent that had believed themselves invincible. And as communications from outer colonies arrived reporting small-scale victories, the broader galactic perception of humanity began to shift, intercepted by neutral, observers and minor spacefaring civilizations who saw, for the first time, a species long dismissed now striking fear into the heart of a dominant power, and within the Carthax command hierarchy, arguments erupted between conservative officers advocating withdrawal to regroup and aggressive factions insisting on continued advance to maintain honor, while Zoward himself realized that the human approach combined patience, deception, technological innovation, and disciplined execution in a way that no Carthax conquest had ever encountered. And as the Armada faltered under the relentless pressure of asymmetric attacks, high-velocity strikes, adaptive energy bursts, and precise coordination that seemed impossible for a species previously deemed primitive, the first real cracks in Carthax morale and operational integrity appeared, setting the stage for a conflict that would no longer be a quick annexation, but a total war, one that would test every calculation, every doctrine, and, ultimately, redefine the standing of humanity in the galaxy, transforming them from a peripheral species into a strategic force whose presence alone now commanded attention, fear, and grudging respect. With the Carthax Armada now stretched across multiple fronts and suffering from mounting losses, Supreme Commander Zowrith orders strategic consolidation near the massive orbital gravity wells of Saturn, believing that concentrating firepower and defensive platforms will restore order and reassert dominance. Yet this very move exposed another layer of human planning, because long before the invasion, human astrophysicists and naval tacticians had studied how extreme gravitational fields could be used not just as hazards but as weapons, and as the Carthax gathered in what they believed was a secure, naturally shielded region, human forces quietly deployed arrays of field manipulators and mass driver platforms hidden within the rings and Trojan asteroid clusters, devices capable of subtly altering microgravity gradients and accelerating dense fragments of matter along carefully calculated vectors. And when the signal was given, the region erupted into controlled chaos as thousands of high-velocity objects, some no larger than vehicles and others the size of small buildings, were hurled into the Carthax formations at relativistic speeds, their approach masked by natural radiation and particulate noise, overwhelming point defense systems that had never been designed to counter such a dense, multi-directional kinetic storm. And the result was a cascading series of impacts that punched through hulls, shattered shield emitters, and ruptured internal compartments, forcing Carthax ships to divert power from weapons to damage control. And as they struggled to stabilize their formations, human strike groups emerged once again from distortion jumps, appearing within the gravitational eddies where conventional navigation was most difficult, striking at crippled vessels and command nodes with ruthless efficiency. And this time the human assault was not merely probing or shaping, but decisive, as coordinated volleys targeted communication hubs, logistics, carriers, and the massive command ships that anchored Carthax control architecture. And in the flagship, Zowrith watched as one of his primary relay vessels disintegrated under a focused barrage, its destruction sending a shock to the network and plunging entire sectors of the Armada into isolated, uncoordinated operation. And in that isolation, human tactics shifted to close-range dominance, with fast attack craft weaving through debris fields and damaged hulls, delivering precision, strikes and boarding actions not for occupation, but for intelligence extraction and sabotage, gathering data on Carthax systems and planning delayed failure devices that would later cripple surviving ships. And the psychological impact on Carthax crews was profound, as the realization spread that even in regions of space they considered naturally defensible, humanity could turn the environment itself into a weapon, and that their enemy did not merely fight battles, but engineered battlefields, shaping space, time, and information to their advantage. And across human command centers, analysts observed the unfolding collapse of Carthax operational coherence, noting how each successful human action forced the aliens into increasingly conservative, fragmented responses, retreating into defensive postures that ceded initiative and momentum. And it was in this phase that Earth's leadership authorized the first outward broadcast to the wider galaxy, a carefully crafted transmission that showed unedited footage of Carthax ships being destroyed, of human fleets maneuvering with precision, and of the declaration that humanity sought no empire but would never accept chains, and that any power attempting to enslave Earth would face total resistance. And this message, relayed by neutral traders in distant listening posts, began to circulate among minor civilizations, many of whom had long lived under the shadow of dominant empires, and for them, the rise of a species that could, Stand against a power like the Carthax Dominion was not just a military development, but a symbol of possibility. And within the Dominion itself, cracks widened as subordinate species and client worlds monitored the conflict and questioned the invincibility of their rulers, while Zaurith, now confronting the reality that the campaign had triggered not submission, but the awakening of a strategic rival, began to understand that the initial decision to treat humanity as a resource to be cataloged and exploited had not merely failed, but had ignited the birth of a galactic superpower whose methods, resolve, and adaptability would reshape the balance of power far beyond the Sol system. As the battles near Jupiter and the asteroid belts intensified, the Carthax fleet found itself increasingly paralyzed by the unpredictability of human tactics, and while their ships were technologically superior in many measurable aspects, the aliens had built their doctrine on assumptions of obedience, predictability, and the psychological collapse of the species they conquered, assumptions that were violently shattered as human crews displayed improvisation under fire, rapid reconfiguration of damaged systems, and daring maneuvers that exploited even the smallest gaps in alien formation geometry, and human engineers aboard orbital stations and concealed platforms continuously fed these tactics with new tools, from adaptive targeting arrays that calculated enemy shield harmonics in real time to compact propulsion modules capable of short-burst repositioning, all designed to turn Carthax confidence into hesitation, hesitation into vulnerability, and vulnerability into destruction. And as Supreme Commander Zaurith observed the mounting losses and erratic performance of his vessels, he attempted to assert command by issuing multi-layered directives, including aggressive pursuit of what appeared to be retreating units, deployment of boarding detachments to capture disabled human ships, and escalation of energy barges to prevent humans from regrouping. But the distortions in communication caused by gravitic noise fields and the sudden, unanticipated movements of human vessels rendered many commands obsolete before they could even be executed, and as Carthax ships collided with unforeseen trajectories or were caught by ambushes, the psychological effects spread, causing units to hesitate in critical moments, fire independently without coordination, or misinterpret sensor data as additional threats, compounding the chaos and amplifying the effectiveness of human strategy. And while all this unfolded in space, Earth and Mars coordinated massive logistical and intelligence operations, sending rapid resupply and maintenance convoys, deploying additional stealth platforms, and using automated drones to repair damaged human vessels in situ, all operating under a network of secure communication channels inaccessible to the Carthax, ensuring that human forces maintained tempo despite the ongoing strain of continuous engagement. And as months passed, the pattern became clear. Humans had not only repelled the initial Carthax incursion, but had systematically dismantled their operational cohesion, forcing the aliens into reactive behavior, where every move was calculated under duress, and no formation could operate without constant monitoring and correction. And the media across human colonies began to report stories of strategic brilliance, heroic actions by ordinary crews, and the terrifying efficiency of human coordination, which served both as morale boosters and psychological warfare, as these accounts inevitably reached neutral observers and sympathetic or frightened minor civilizations, influencing their perceptions of the unfolding conflict and subtly shaping potential alliances. And within the Carthax High Command, dissent grew, as younger officers, conditioned to trust doctrine above all else, questioned the feasibility of continued engagement without significant adaptation, while veteran commanders recognized that they were facing a species whose ingenuity, resilience, and willingness to accept risk in calculated ways transcended every prior encounter. And as human forces pressed these advantages, striking at weak points, exploiting misalignments, and drawing isolated Carthax elements into traps that allowed concentrated fire to achieve results disproportionate to the number of attackers, the tide of the campaign shifted irreversibly, marking the transition from a defensive struggle to a strategic offensive. And in the shadows of the outer planets, humans began to experiment with broader deception tactics, creating phantom fleets through holographic projections and sensor distortions, simulating attacks in regions far from their true positions to divert Carthax resources, stretch their attention, and reinforce the illusion that humanity had forces beyond what was physically present. And the cumulative effect of these operations was devastating, as alien morale, cohesion, and confidence eroded further with each successive engagement, leading Zaurith to grim realization that humanity was no longer a minor obstacle to be subjugated, but a true galactic adversary whose rise had been triggered by the very act of attempted enslavement, and that the consequence of their arrogance would define the coming decades, if not centuries, of interstellar politics and warfare. As the shockwaves in the Saturn engagement spread to the Carthax command hierarchy, the Dominion attempted to stabilize its collapsing front by invoking ancient protocols reserved for existential threats, mobilizing reserve fleets from conquered regions, and ordering total resource extraction from subject worlds to fuel a renewed offensive. But this decision only accelerated the unraveling of their authority, because the very act of stripping defenses and conscripting auxiliary forces exposed how deeply the war with humanity had disrupted the imperial balance, and intelligence gathered by human reconnaissance and diplomatic channels revealed unrest, hesitation, and in some cases open defiance among species that had long lived under Carthax rule, watching with growing belief that the once invincible conquerors could be resisted. And in response, human leadership expanded its strategy beyond pure military confrontation into a coordinated campaign of information, influence, and selective alliance building, quietly establishing contact with neutral and subjugated civilizations, sharing proof of Carthax losses, and offering technology, protection, and mutual defense pacts, not as an empire seeking tribute, but as a coalition survival. And this approach, grounded in the human instinct to form networks rather than rigid hierarchies, began to produce results as independent systems opened their space for resupply, intelligence sharing, and covert basing, further extending human operational reach. And in space, the Carthax attempted a renewed concentrated assault met a very different opponent than the one they had first encountered, because human fleets now operated with confidence, experience, and a deep understanding of alien doctrine, anticipating formation patterns, predicting command delays, and preemptively positioning assets to counter every major thrust. And when the Dominion launched a massive multi-vector offensive toward the inner system, hoping to overwhelm human defenses through sheer scale, they found themselves facing layered kill zones supported by distributed sensor webs, autonomous drone swarms, and rapid response strike groups that flowed like a single organism, each unit aware of the others, each action reinforcing a larger design. And the battle that followed was no longer a series of ambushes, but a sustained campaign of dominance, with human forces controlling engagement ranges, dictating tempo, and forcing Carthax ships into defensive spirals where their heavy weapons and centralized control structures became liabilities rather than strengths. And as losses mounted and retreat corridors were cut off, entire Carthax formations surrendered or self-destructed to avoid capture, a concept once unthinkable for a species raised on the certainty of victory. And in the flagship, Supreme Commander Zaurith confronted reports that shook the foundations of Dominion ideology, that client worlds were refusing to supply resources, that allied species were opening channels to humanity, that the narrative of inevitable conquest was collapsing, and that the humans, once labeled as primitives to be cataloged and utilized, were now recognized across multiple star systems as a rising power whose combination of technological innovation, strategic flexibility, and political restraint made them not just dangerous but attractive as partners. And in that realization lay the true transformation, because the war had evolved beyond territory and fleets into a contest over legitimacy and influence and humanity, by fighting not as an empire but as a determined, adaptable civilization defending its freedom, had ignited a shift in galactic perception that no amount of Carthax force could easily reverse, setting the stage for a final reckoning in which the question would no longer be whether Earth could survive, but how far the consequences of its defiance would echo through the stars. The final phase of the conflict unfolded not with a single climactic explosion, but with a series of irreversible decisions that reshaped the balance of power across known space, as the Carthax Dominion, its fleets depleted, its command network fractured, and its subject worlds wavering, attempted one last assertion of authority by concentrating remaining forces around their core systems, declaring that any further advance by humanity would be met with the full destructive capacity of their civilization. And it was in response to this declaration that human leadership, now operating at the center of a growing coalition of independent and formerly subjugated species, made a choice that defined a new era, not to seek annihilation of the Carthax homeworlds, but to demonstrate in undeniable terms that the age of unilateral domination was over, and so a massive, meticulously coordinated operation was launched combining human fleets, allied squadrons, and autonomous systems into a multi-layered approach that bypassed outer defenses through distortion jumps and information warfare, isolating Carthag's core command nodes and logistics hubs without immediately destroying population centers. And when the Dominion's remaining battle groups attempted to respond, they found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn, their formations anticipated, their communication relays neutralized, their energy reserves disrupted by targeted strikes on infrastructure until the once proud armada was reduced to scattered, powerless remnants. And in the command chamber of the Carthag's capital, Zalrith received the final reports, not heroic last stands or glorious counterattacks, but of systems going dark, of fleets surrendering, of allied species declaring independence and aligning with a coalition led by Earth. And in that moment, he understood that the attempt to enslave humanity had not merely failed, but had awakened a force that combined military capability with strategic vision and political restraint. A civilization that did not seek to replace one empire with another, but to ensure that no single power could again impose chains on the many. And when human envoys transmitted the terms, they were firm and uncompromising in defense of autonomy, yet measured in their demands, calling for the dissolution of the Dominion's coercive structures, the recognition of sovereign rights for all subject species, and the establishment of a council where power will be balanced by collective security rather than enforced by conquest. And as these terms were accepted under the undeniable reality of human and allied dominance, the galaxy witnessed an age defined by fear and the beginning of one shaped by cautious cooperation. And across Earth and its colonies, there was no celebration of extermination or conquest, but a quiet, profound recognition that humanity had crossed a threshold, that a species once dismissed as primitive and divided had proven capable of unity, innovation, and resolve on a scale that could alter the fate of civilizations, and that the stars would henceforth remember the moment when an attempt at enslavement instead gave rise to a superpower, one forged not by the desire to rule, but by the refusal to kneel. And in the years that followed, as new treaties were signed, new alliances formed, and former enemies learned to coexist under a different balance of power, the story of how Earth had stood against the Carthag's dominion became a defining legend, a warning to any who would underestimate the will of a free people, and a reminder that in the vast darkness between the stars, it was not the oldest or the largest empires that determined the future, but those who, when confronted with extinction or bondage, chose to fight, adapt, and rise, and in doing so, reshape the destiny of the galaxy itself.